What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and see this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And over the years in the American Mafia, there is no crew more ruthless than the Gemini Lounge crew. They killed their victims with reckless abandon, using a very primitive method to take care of their deeds. They killed everyone: rats, cooperators, people that knew too much, innocent people, and even a sex offender. The very interesting but wild story of some of the victims, of the 54 known victims that the Gemini Lounge crew was said to have taken care of. There was probably more like 200 or 150. But in the end, they're the most lethal crew in the history of the American mob. The story of some of the Gemini Lounge crew's victims. Next on Sit Down Shorts. As we know, the chief leader of the Gemini Lounge crew was Roy DeMayo. Roy DeMayo would come to power really in the 60s and the early 60s. He would begin really as a car thief, an earner, someone that could make money for different subsets of different crime families, including the Lucchese's and then the Gambino crime family. In 1966, a young Roy DeMayo would meet his protege, a young Jewish teenager called Chris Rothenberg. Now, Rothenberg is said to always wanted to be Italian, but he was Jewish. And he would slot in as a very lethal individual in his own right and slotted right in under the tutelage of Roy DeMayo. Now, initially, Roy DeMayo, as I said, did some things for the Lucchese crime family as an associate, but he'd then become an associate under feared Gambino cop regime, Nino Gaji, who would take him under his wing and allow him to earn, but also do what he had to do with zeal. And that's exactly what the Demeo Crew did. Roy DeMayo would grab a whole host of killers around him, including his cousin, Joe Dracula Guglielmo, the Gemini Twins, Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, and an individual called Henry Borelli, who was dangerous in his own right. This crew would end up taking care of so many murders. And as I said, we're going to get into some of them. The first murder that was said to be committed by a member of the Gemini Lounge crew and was said to also be Roy DeMayo's first involved an individual in 1973 called Paul Rothenberg. According to reports, Nino Gaji and Roy DeMayo allegedly were trying to extort Mr. Rothenberg. Mr. Rothenberg was a partner in a sex film distributing company called Arrow Film Labs. Basically, they had a lab down on Spring Street in Manhattan, and they were putting out a ton of 8mm hardcore porn videos. DeMayo and Gaji were looking to muscle in on the business. Rothenberg kind of balked, and they went to the FBI. His place ended up being raided, and they were worried, Gaji and DeMayo, that Rothenberg was going to talk. On July 29th, 1973, Mr. Rothenberg was beaten, shot, and found dead in Long Island. This was the first murder committed by Roy DeMayo and this crew. This was a grisly one, and they ended up doing it because they were worried. This was the DeMeo crew's way of doing things. It didn't matter if you were an informant. If they thought you were an informant, life didn't mean much to them, and they felt like, you know what? We're just going to get rid of you. Now, the first joint murder done by multiple members of this crew in June 13th of 1975, which was said to include not only Roy DeMayo, but Joey Testa, Anthony Center, Henry Borelli, and Chris Rothenberg, was when they took care of an individual called Andre Katz. Now, Mr. Katz was a 23-year-old part owner. His father owned an auto company in, I believe, Queens. And what Katz was doing was he was buying stolen cars from the DeMeo Crew. Something would happen where they weren't happy with something he did, and they wanted Mr. Katz dead. So what they would do is they basically grab a woman off the street and basically have her lure Mr. Katz to an unknown location. At that point, they would do some things to him that he surely did not deserve. They would ultimately kill him, dismember his body, and stuff his head into a garbage compactor. They would then dismember parts of his body and strew them behind a grocery store in Rockaway, Queens. What would happen is ultimately a passerby walking their dog would discover a leg in a lot. Ultimately, police were called and they would find the rest of this body and torso behind the supermarket in Queens. Today, that location is still a supermarket, a Key Food. This was a very grisly murder, and this was a murder that really perfected something that the group would create called the Gemini method. Okay, this was a messy murder. A lot of things happened that shouldn't have, and they needed to clean themselves up a little bit in a way. Now, again, guys, I do want to stress, I will do my best to provide details of these murders. Unfortunately, though, there are certain things that I can't say on YouTube or they won't monetize my video. And again, I don't put videos out. I don't make a ton on this. Anything I can do to make some money on these videos, I will. And some of the subject matter in this video is a little grisly, so I'll try to do my best. But this was a very brutal murder. This was a brutal murder of a young kid who just deviously got involved with the wrong people. Another very high-profile murder they would be involved with was the murder of Lucchese mobster Joseph Joe Brachini. Now, Brachini was a pretty interesting individual in his own right. He was very active in the porn business in Manhattan. He also had other ways to earn, including a car dealership he owned in Woodside, Queens. At one point, he got into a physical altercation. What they got into a physical altercation about was unknown, but according to reports, Joe Brachini beat up Roy DeMayo and hurt him physically. Now, initially, Roy DeMayo accepted the beating, and that was that. That we do know, though, Roy DeMayo was not going to just forget about that. He wanted Joe Brachini dead. The problem was he knew he would not ultimately get this sanctioned by anyone in the Lucchese crime family. He had a beating. These guys, this was a made guy. In the end, you do what you have to do. He would basically say to Nino Gaji, hey, let's make this look like a robbery going bad. Let's get this guy. Let's wrap this up. He would send one of his chief enforcers, Henry Borelli, to Woodside, Queens to take care of Brachini. According to reports, members of the car dealership were tied up to make it look like a robbery. And Henry Borelli went to town on Mr. Brachini. He would allegedly beat him up and shoot him. And that was that for Joe Brachini. And again, Joe Brachini's murder looked like a robbery. And this was something that the DeMayo Gemini Lounge crew did regularly. They would try to do things when they weren't cutting people up. They wanted to make things look like stuff they weren't, i.e. robbery, sexual assault, things like that. They were trying to cover their tracks a little bit. There were some murders, though, they did where they just threw you out in the open. They wanted people to see. The next very high-profile murder, and some people may have heard of this one, but it is a wild one. It included Nino Gaji. In 1976, in summer of that year, Nino Gaji had bought a vacation home in Hallandale Beach, Florida, a suburb of Miami. Very beautiful, very picturesque. He had this nice vacation home, needed some electrical work done, and he would hire an individual called George Byram. Mr. Byram was a known electrical contractor in the area, and he would do the work. Mr. Byram obviously found out. Mr. Gaji obviously was a richer man. He was from New York. He probably had some money in his home, in the vacation home, and he had a burglary crew that he was fond of. Mr. Byram tells this burglary crew, hey, this guy ain't here much. He's from New York. Go rob his house in Hallandale Beach. The problem was he didn't know who Nino Gaji was. This was probably the last person you wanted to rob at any level ever. Nino Gaji finds out that Mr. Byram hired this crew, and that was that for George Byram. He would instruct Roy DeMayo to go down to Florida and send a message. He would lure Mr. Byram to a hotel room where he would shoot him multiple times and chop him up in a shower. The problem for Roy DeMayo was workers in the hotel spooked him, so he left the scene. Hotel workers would identify, though, Roy DeMayo at one point in the hotel. George Byram probably was one of the dumber people we'll talk about here. There are certain people you just don't go against. You shouldn't rob anybody, quite honestly, but there are people that do that. These are not the types of people you want to rob. Another very interesting but sad murder occurred in July 26, 1977. An individual seen here on the left, John Quinn, would be found dead in a car in New York City. John Quinn was a car thief who allegedly inched in too much on Gambino car stealing turf. He was taken out with zeal and taken out very easily. This was a public murder. They wanted him to be found. They wanted to send a message. Now, sadly, during all this as well, seen on the right, 19-year-old Sherry Golden was also found dead just days later in Brooklyn. Her body had bullet holes in its head, and she was slumped over in the passenger seat of a car. According to people that knew about these people, Miss Golden just probably knew too much. It's unlikely she was involved with stealing cars, but she was the gumata to Mr. Quinn. And anytime someone knows too much, according to the DeMayo Crew, they needed it to go. Now, Paul Castellano was allegedly upset about the fact that they had to take out Sherry Golden. But as usual, Mr. Castellano forgave the crimes committed by Roy DeMayo because he was making money. And they felt like it was just something that needed to be done. On March 23rd, 1978, the body of a mob associate called Patrick Presenzano was found on this block of the 2300 block of Boynton Place in Sheepshead Bay, just near Avenue X. Mr. Presenzano was found beaten, shot, and had his throat slit to ear. Now, what we know about Presenzano is he was allegedly a large-scale drug trafficker. He lived not only in New York, but in Miami. And from what I understand, Mr. Presenzano allegedly hawked jewelry off a member of the Gemini Lounge crew. Mr. DeMayo basically said, hey, look, give the jewelry back. Everything's going to be fine. Presenzano balked, was seen wearing it around New York. Roy DeMayo didn't want to deal with him any longer, and that was that. Now, something interesting about this murder. According to the report, Mr. Presenzano was found with his pants pulled down. According to investigators, they felt like the goal was to make this look like some sort of sexual crime, which is interesting. Again, trying to push investigators off on some of these crimes to make them look a little bit different than they are. Now, if we look into the background of Mr. Presenzano, he was an associate of the mob, and there have been reports that I've learned that this may have been Angelo Presenzano's son. Angelo Presenzano was a high-profile guy in the Bonanno crime family. There are some questions, though. They did spell their names differently, and I didn't want to completely put that out without absolutely knowing, but it is something to keep in mind. Mr. Presenzano was a mob associate, but he made the DeMayo Crew look stupid, and the DeMayo Crew was going to get back at him. One of the most grisly murders that was committed by the Gemini Lounge crew was that of a gym owner from Mill Basin, Brooklyn, and it would occur on May 16th, 1978. The victim was said to be a person called Michael DiCarlo. Now, when we look back on all the victims of the Gemini Lounge crew, there were about 54 that we know of. There were probably many more, but 54 that we were known of. This was one victim that we may be able to say deserved his end. According to reports, Mr. DiCarlo was a Lucchese associate and was said to be very involved in New York City in the prostitution markets. He was allegedly gay. He had gay people around him. He was doing gay prostitution, according to people that knew. And according to a report done by the NYPD, he was named in a gay prostitution ring at one point. He was kicking up to the mob, allegedly. It was also talked about that Mr. DiCarlo allegedly was involved with young boys. According to people, he molested young boys. And Mr. DiCarlo needed to die. We can agree with that, probably. I don't want to say too much because, again, YouTube will take the video down or not monetize it. But Mr. DiCarlo was a child molester. Let's just be honest with ourselves here. Mr. DiCarlo had to go, and the Lucchese crime family would find out and basically asked the DeMeo Crew to take care of Mr. DiCarlo. As I said, on May 16th, 1978, Mr. DiCarlo was kidnapped and beaten to death with a hammer. According to Roy DeMeo, he was blown away watching Anthony Center hit Mr. DiCarlo in the head with a hammer. There was also talk of other things that went on. He was eventually shot multiple times, and Joe Dracula would allegedly use a broomstick on Mr. DiCarlo. I'm not going to get into how he used that broomstick, but you can probably think about that in your own head. Let's just say the broomstick was used in a certain way that Mr. DiCarlo may or may not have enjoyed. Again, ultimately, Mr. DiCarlo was then dismembered and thrown in the Fountain Avenue dump. When we look back on this one, we can likely say he deserved it. A pretty public murder was that of an individual called Gary Gardine. This would happen on November 30th, 1978. Gary Gardine was a drug dealer who was fronted several pounds of marijuana by Chris Rothenberg, who was the drug dealer of the crew. He was fronted the drugs in hopes that he would pay it back. Gary Gardine didn't pay the money back, and Chris Rothenberg wanted him offed. He would off him on that date in 1978. Mr. Gardine would be shot in the head multiple times, stuffed in a car, and the car would be set on fire. This was a public message by the Gemini Lounge crew. When you take our drugs and don't pay us, this is what happens. They were ruthless. Setting a car on fire is ruthless with someone inside. Roy DeMayo killed a lot of people. We all know that. But there are innocent people he killed, and this was probably one of the saddest murders in Mafia history. In 1979, according to the book For the Sins of My Father by Roy DeMayo's son Albert, he would highlight a very paranoid Roy DeMayo. By this point, Roy DeMayo had bit off more than he could chew, and his relationships with Chris Rothenberg were starting to affect him going forward. Rothenberg was selling a lot of drugs, which was an edict that he couldn't do, and he was also getting involved with Cuban drug dealers. At one point, he would accept coke from Cuban drug dealers, then kill them and not pay them back. They were after him. They were after Roy, and Roy knew it. According to the book For the Sins of My Father, DeMayo's kid would talk about the fact that by this point, Roy DeMayo was a coke addict. He was doing a lot of cocaine, and he was super paranoid. In fact, when Roy DeMayo was found dead years later, toxicology reports would do a look into his organs, and they would find that his liver and organs were basically gone and were that of an old man. Now, Roy DeMayo was not a senior citizen by any means at this point. It's just some of the substance abuse really weared upon his body. He was paranoid and he was worried, and he had a right to be. The sad thing, though, was in 1979, the wrong person would knock on his door. It was that of 19-year-old Dominic Vergucci. Now, Vergucci, by all accounts, was just a young man who was trying to make a little money as he was in college. He took a job as a vacuum cleaner salesman, and on that day in 1979, he walked into the wrong neighborhood and knocked on the wrong door. That day, he would knock on the door of Roy DeMayo. Roy DeMayo would chase the young Vergucci out of his house alongside his cousin, Joe Dracula. They would shoot at the car multiple times. They had mistaken Mr. Vergucci for a Cuban hitman. The Cuban hitman allegedly, keep in mind he wasn't a Cuban hitman, but Vergucci would escape with his life. The problem was the young man didn't get far. DeMayo would catch up to him and fill his car with bullets. We can still see his leg hanging out of the Nissan Maxima. This was the saddest victim of all these people. In fact, about 50 or so of these people likely deserved what they got. Mr. Vergucci was just an innocent man who, due to the paranoia of Roy DeMayo and his constant drug use, died that day. We say rest in peace to Dominic Vergucci. Ultimately, Chris Rothenberg would become a victim. He would be killed subsequently after his behavior with Cuban drug lords. His behavior got him killed. He probably had to die. It just got to be too much. On January 10th, 1983, Roy DeMayo would be found dead as well. He would be found in a car in Brooklyn. His body was decomposed and had sat there for several days. DeMayo had recently been arrested, and members of the Gambino crime family, including Nino Gaji and Paul Castellano, worried a little bit about Roy DeMayo. Could he be trusted behind the box? If we know anything, and this had been perfected by Roy DeMayo, if you knew too much, you were probably just better off dead. And that was that for Roy DeMayo. Ultimately, for members of the Gemini Lounge crew, as we know, most of them would have sad endings or rightful endings. Nino Gaji, ultimately, in the mid-'80s, would be arrested and sent to prison. He would die in the late 80s. Several other members, though, of the Gemini Lounge crew would actually remain on the street for several years, including the Gemini Twins, Joey Testa, and Anthony Center. They would ultimately take up umbrage in the Lucchese crime family and start killing for Lucchese lunatic Anthony Casso. They themselves were also involved in some very high-profile murders, including that of a gangster from Russia called Vladimir Reznikov. Now, Casso would be approached by Marat Balagula, a Russian individual that controlled the gas tax scheme that the mob made tons of money off of. Balagula was extorted or allegedly threatened to be extorted by Reznikov. Balagula couldn't handle him, so he went to Casso. They would set up Reznikov, and the Gemini Twins would kill him in 1986 in Brooklyn. It's a high-profile murder of a very high-profile Russian individual, and these two guys took him out quite easily. Now, ultimately, for the Gemini Twins, Joey Testa and Anthony Center, they would both in 1989 get life in prison for their crimes. They will both die in federal prison. They are both still alive, though. Joey Testa is 67 years old, and he's cooling his heels at FCI Terminal Island, a federal prison in California. His twin or so, Anthony Center, is also 67 years old. He is at Allenwood Federal Prison in Pennsylvania. These two will die the way they should in federal prison. Henry Borelli also basically got a life sentence. He is 74 years old and at FCI Gilmer. His projected release date is October 2083. Let's be honest. He ain't going to make it to 2083. Henry Borelli will also die in federal prison, a place that he should. One final note here. Joe Dracula Guglielmo is one individual that never actually faced a prison or jury for his crimes. He would basically disappear, and no one quite knows what happened to him. Was he killed? Maybe. But according to Albert DeMayo, in For the Sins of My Father, he would say that right before the indictments came down, he would take Joe Dracula to an airport and never saw him again. What happened to Joe Dracula? We'll never ultimately know. What do you think happened to him? Let me know in the comments below. Now, one thing I do want to mention before we wrap it up, one name that I did not mention, Richard Kuklinski. I wanted to nip this in the bud very quickly. Richard Kuklinski was not a mob killer. He never killed anyone related to the mob and did not kill for Roy DeMayo. He says he did, but as we know about Richard Kuklinski, he is a pathological liar who never killed anyone for the mob. Did he kill people? Yes. He was a serial killer. He killed people for no reason. He would jab people for no reason. He would kill people for no reason. He is not a mob killer. He didn't kill Joe Gallo. He didn't kill Paul Castellano. He didn't kill Carmine Galante. He is a babbling idiot who late in his life in prison came up with these fantasies and wrote a book and tried to tell everybody he was a mob killer. He didn't know anyone in the mob. He never had any interactions with anyone in the mob, and he didn't kill for the mob. He was not a part of this crew and should never be mentioned in the same sentence with this crew. They're the most violent crew in the history of the mob, and that's not to even be questioned. They were ruthless, they were demonic, and they were violent. As always, if you enjoy this video, please hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, if you feel like it, hit that super thanks button, throw me a donation. I may or may not get this video monetized, so I appreciate if you do that. As always, we'll see you next time here on the Sit Down.